Good morning, colleagues. As you remember, yesterday on our last lecture we spoke about mobilization and demobilization in Russian Empire. And this morning we are going to continue in some way this topic, this case. Our next lecture will speak about territories of mobilization. So let me introduce our lecturer, Professor P'єр Purseґль. His research are mainly concentrated on territories of mobilization, and today, this morning, he is going to speak about the urban geography of the First World War in his lecture, Fields of Battle and Territories of Mobilization. So you are welcome. Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning to all of you. I'm pleased to see so many of you so early in the morning. Well done. I'd just like to thank the organizers very warmly for the kind invitation. It is a real pleasure to be here in the Ukraine. A very great intellectual pleasure to have been part of this conference. I think it's been terrific. Well, this is a pretty sad day for Europe and Europeans. So I'm hoping I'm not going to sound too distracted, but I hope you will excuse me if I do. But at least it's a great pleasure to be here in a place where I think people have got a better sense of the true meaning of democracy, the rule of law, and European solidarity. So it's another reason to be very happy to be here today. Let me start with a quote. Contemporary cities are the battlegrounds on which global powers and stubbornly local meanings and identities meet. It's a quote by Bauman. And here, of course, Bauman considers the urban experience in a context of what he calls liquid modernity, a set of conditions rather different, of course, from the modernity that brought about the First World War. Yet I believe this quote underlines how the urban experience is often produced by the clash of global and local forces. And I believe this is a question that we may want to consider as historians, scholars of the First World War. The question here is for us to find the appropriate way to articulate and integrate the urban experience of the conflict in a transnational and global history of the conflict. And this lecture finds me at the crossroads of three different projects in which I'm going to draw today. First, a comparative history of urban mobilization in France and Britain, which was the subject of my first book that was published in France in 2013, that I'm currently revising and editing for an English translation. I was also part of what is an ongoing reflection on the conditions of European and global history of the First World War, and recently published in the latest issue of this Annal a series of articles with a friend who's a Latin American historian on global history and the way we could go about writing the global history of the First World War. And I'm also working now on the urban reconstruction of France and Belgium. So I took your invitation to reflect, as an opportunity to reflect upon the type of urban history I've written. I also take it as a chance to interrogate a series of notions and methodological premises which run implicitly through my work. Premises, not to say prejudices, perhaps, I've not necessarily questioned as thoroughly as I should have done. So it's an opportunity for me to think critically about what I've done, but perhaps most importantly, what I've not done. To think about what an urban history could look like from a comparative and transnational point of view. So this is what I'm going to try to do in the next 40 minutes, to reflect upon my own practice of urban history, and to place this reflection in the context of the wider interrogation about the global history of a global conflict. And I'm then hoping to make a series of propositions around which perhaps we could envisage how to write a comparative, if not global, at least a European urban history of the First War. And I really emphasize the word proposition, so I'm really hoping that you won't hesitate to criticize and feedback on what I'm about to say, because I'm very much looking forward to that. Now, in this period of centennial commemorations, the historiographies and memories of the First War remain largely ensconced in national, if not nationalist, narratives, while transnational and comparative approaches have already yielded undeniable scholarly advances. The search for an elusive European history of the war continues. Likewise, notwithstanding the weight of academic fashions, the profession is yet to produce a global history of the conflict that would do justice to its geographic spread, as well as to the circulations and transfers that define its experience. Despite the growth in transnational and comparative studies of the war, most historians continue to pay lip service to the European and global history of the war. And there are obviously exceptions, and a few of you have contributed to this European and global history of the war. But many colleagues still remain confined within well-established national and disciplinary boundaries. But there also remains a detrimental gap, I think, between the military, social, and cultural histories of the war, as well as between disciplines and methodologies deployed within the field. And I believe, and I'm going to try to argue, that urban history is one of the ways in which we can address this gap. Now, there have, of course, been several attempts to write a global history of the conflicts. And these tend to belong to two different genres. The first one may be described as grand synthesis, as it were. And it's perhaps best exemplified by Hugh Strome's first volume of the history of the First World War. Few scholars are equipped to deal with the narrative and analytical challenges that the global history of the war raises. The second attempt is collective in nature and can be found under the form of collective volumes or journals' special issues. But they do, however, often by necessity, of course, attempt to rely on the juxtaposition of national and disciplinary case studies. Now, these pioneering works have made an important contribution to our understanding of the global dimensions of the war. But there remains, I think, a critical issue, and that is how to integrate in a common analytical framework the diversity and the complexity of the experiences that unfolded on a global scale. And the question is all the more pressing that the historiography continues to be dominated by Eurocentric perspectives. And yet, though Europe, and Northwestern Europe in particular, I think that's probably how we should put it, that this is a historiography that's still dominated by Northwestern Europe-centric. That's not even a word, but you see what I'm getting at, perspective. Now, of course, Northwestern Europe was a strategic epicenter of the war, and that certainly accounts for the importance of that of the Western Front in the historiography. But we should also pay greater attention to the peripheries of the conflict. Now, for many of us, I think, including in this room, and certainly for the people who were involved in this special issue of Liz and Al, the idea was to contribute to wider reflections on the transformations of warfare in the 20th century, to question specifically the character of the First World War, and to think afresh of both the chronology and the geography of the conflict. And I'm happy to go back to these issues. Now, I'd just like to move on a bit quickly, because I think I'm probably going to run out of time otherwise. But I think one of the key questions for us is to find ways to combine scales of analysis to ensure that our research fits with the spaces of experience that the belligerent populations lived in and through. So it may be time not only to move beyond this opposition between centers and peripheries, to explore what Antoinette Burton, post-colonial scholar, historian of empire, called the structural below and the geographic below, to challenge those Eurocentric approaches I was talking about. But most importantly, the idea is to find a way to challenge the conventional categories of analysis inherited from political, diplomatic, and operational history, nation-state, belligerency, etc. And this is where I think urban historians can play a critical role. Historiography of the First War has long been confined within a very narrow chronology, 1914-1918, which in itself is, of course, a heritage of diplomatic and military history conceived from the Western Front and the point of view of Western Front powers. And increasingly, we conceive this war as a continuum of colonial conflicts, European wars, civil wars, revolutions, political violence, and genocide. So what I would try to argue here is for the need to place the urban experience of the war in the longue durée of urbanization as well. So let's see how so this is basically the outline of the lecture. I'm first going to try to see how reflection on the geography of belligerence in the First War may help us devise that kind of agenda. Now, what am I talking about here when we talk of a historical geography or geographic history of the war? A history that would be attentive to notions of space and place. To an extent, that kind of perspective has been encouraged by Tim Snyder's Bloodlines, that I'm sure you're familiar with. In a sense, locating the war experience, asking where the war or genocide, as Snyder did, happened, prompts us to rethink what the war was and when it happened. Concerned with the transformations of warfare, this historical geography of the war would hopefully further our understanding of the totalizing and globalizing logic of the First World War. But before I go any further, I just want to clarify what I am not arguing for. And I'm not arguing, to put it bluntly, for spatial turn in First World War studies. Please do not get me wrong on this. I mean, first of all, because history and social sciences have always been concerned with space, and even before the institutionalization of geography as a discipline. So I'm not sure that we need yet another term. And second, asserting the spatiality of war is merely stating the obvious. When soldiers fight with maps, battles transform landscapes and terrains and create their own imaginative geography. So I'm not sure that talking about spatial turn actually bring anything really to the conversation. Now the problem there, because I still think that we need to think seriously about what we mean by spaces, is that there's a voluminous literature theorizing spatial perspectives in the social sciences and the humanities. But there's no consensus in geography, urban studies, social and cultural history on the definition of space and place. So let me just clarify very briefly how I understand it. And here I'm relying on the work of Michel de Certeau. When I talk about place, I refer to location, to the natural and material environment in which historical actors go about their business. Place, in other words, is positional. Space, by contrast, is defined by movement, by the vectors of circulation of people, goods, and cultural representations. Space, in other words, is about relations. It's relational. Now, it's of course difficult to maintain a clear-cut distinction between space and place because historical experience constantly blurred the boundaries between the two. One moves from one place to another to interact, trade, and fight with one another. And these are processes invested with and ascribed meaning and cultural significance. Both place and space are culturally constructed. And the key point here is that we should not lose sight of the materiality, or to put in another way, of the environmental nature of space and place. So I just wanted to put this out there, that we're clear on the categories that I'm going to try to use. Now when you look at the way the historiography of the war has evolved, it's effectively relied on a very conventional geography of the war, inherited from conventional operational history, where the war is effectively, or the map of the war is effectively defined by belligerency, by military operations. So what we suggest is to shift the emphasis to belligerence, to processes of mobilization, to the mobilization of resources in response to the war. And that allows us, we argue, to redefine both the spaces and the temporalities of war. So what we try to do, and I think what still needs to be done largely, is to locate the conflict, to trace its gradual penetration within and beyond the belligerent empires, to include the experience of neutrals and colonial societies, to look at the global flows of manpower, material resources, as well as at the environmental and cultural impacts of the conflict. And what we try to do in this way is to rethink the experience of combat, of mobilization, and of reconstruction. Now, I'm not going to go any further than this. I just want to sort of zoom in on the urban aspects of that new geography of the war that we are trying to elaborate. As armies thought their way through the continental landscape, in Europe in particular, the conflict inflicted unprecedented levels upon urbanized Europe. Scores of towns along the western and eastern fronts came to encapsulate the nature and meaning of an industrial conflict waged with unprecedented firepower. The war was often waged over an urban battlefield, so there's no need, I think, to insist here. Nonetheless, I encourage you to read the work of Alex Dodal, my former colleague at Trinity College in Dublin, who's produced a remarkable book, which is coming, hopefully, very soon now, on those urban populations that stayed under fire in the zones of military operations. And in towns and cities where home is the front, urban populations found themselves at odds and also out of sync with the rest of the national community. And Alex's work is about France, but I think there's something to be said to expand his framework of analysis. Furthermore, many occupied communities also find themselves under the fire of their fellow countrymen and allies. And in such circumstances, as Alex has shown, the war experience also dramatically redefined the relationship between these urban populations and the rest of their national communities. So it's perhaps important to note that this complex urban geography of victimization also meant that the urban populations experienced the war along different and specific temporalities. So, just an illustration of the fact that when you start thinking seriously about the spaces of the war experience, you always have to think about the different chronologies, the different temporalities that historical actors develop and experience. And that is true if you look at mobilization, combat, and reconstruction. And the key point here is to warn against the common conflation that I did, I think, largely myself as well, in my first book. Conflation of the urban experience of the war with that of the home front. And urban does not systematically mean home front, and that's something we need to bear in mind, I think. One of the most enduring images of the First World War is that of a tragic stalemate, embodied by millions of soldiers stuck in the mud of the Western Front in particular. But it belies the fact that belligerent space is defined by mobility to and from the combat zones, as much as it is by the apparent static line of trenches. A particular experience of wartime mobility was that of volunteers who left neutral countries to join belligerent armies on both sides. This transnational volunteerism was partly a product of nationalist movements, eager to seize the opportunity to remap Europe. In the US in particular, immigrant communities, Poles, Lithuanians, Czechs, and others, mobilized politically and militarily. It's the case for Italians as well, and Latin American men, Armenians, and many other groups that you're familiar with. And we actually don't know much about, or as much as we should about this group and these communities, but the point I want to make is that these stories were often, if not always, urban stories, played out in the streets of Rio de Janeiro or New York, for instance. If you look at mobilization and at the way the warring states deploy their bureaucratic and logical expertise to extract, transport, and allocate human and material resources to their armies in the field. You also get a very different appreciation of the geography of war, because the outcome of the conflict largely depended on the belligerent's capacity to control the space in between supply sites and the battlefield. And here, of course, the Maritime Empire, and Britons in particular, held a decisive advantage. Surprisingly, however, the historiography of the war has paid little attention to logistics, which I think is a shame. It's changing, though. There are a couple of works emerging now. Yet the war had a defining impact on the nature and density of infrastructure networks both within and outside the belligerent nations, within and outside Europe. And it often requires significant upgrades and the creation of new infrastructures which reshaped the territories of belligerents, of their colonies, and of neutral countries alike. And here a good illustration is the experience of port cities, from Osaka to Buenos Aires, through Lagos, that testifies to the impact of war on infrastructures across the globe. So the point here is that historians of towns and cities do have a specific contribution to make to the global history of the war. Now let me move on to what I've tried to do in my work on the urban history of mobilization in France and Britain. Now, this is a book that started its life, like many, as a doctoral project that was designed in the late 1980s, and I think it sort of bears the scars of that particular historiographical period in many ways. And it drew on a limited but very rich, nonetheless, historiography of the urban experience of the war. In particular, it built on the perspective, if not the methodology, of the Capital Cities of War project, directed by J. Winter. And what I tried to do was to write a comparative cities of two medium-sized towns in the war, one in France, my hometown, and one in England. And rightly or wrongly, however, I was not particularly interested in writing a conventional urban history of the war. It's a conversation I've had with Claire many times. I sort of realized that I was doing urban history quite late in the day. I was not particularly interested with, rightly or wrongly again, perhaps wrongly, so much with standards of living, with social mobility, with spatial segregation, with urban morphology, all those classical, conventional, and very important questions that urban historians usually ask. Now these questions remain, they were already then, and they remain relevant. But I was nonetheless much keener to use the urban lens to scrutinize the process of mobilization, to pursue the comparative agenda defined by John Horn in State, Society, and Mobilization. The idea was to use urban history to explore how belligerent societies responded to the transformations of warfare, to what John Horn called the totalizing logic of the war. I set out to investigate the culture, the sociology, and the politics of urban belligerence in both countries. And to analyze the modalities of urban mobilization, well, I did what many of you have done and do. I look at the range of practices elicited by the war effort, the raising and support of local military units, the assistance to war victims, various charitable initiatives, and the commemoration of military and patriotic service, and nothing that would actually surprise you much, I imagine. And as a result, I focused on three main issues. The role of urban identities in the process of national mobilization, something that we talked about yesterday, the role of urban contention, of social movements in this process, and on the wartime reconfiguration of the state at the urban level. And very early on, it appeared that one needed to place wartime mobilization in the broader context of the nationalization of the masses in the long 19th century. And I looked at social movements to analyze how these populations articulated their urban, local, and national identities. And in both cases, the mobilization of class and community in response to what was effectively perceived as an existential crisis drew on place and space, both as cognitive and political resources, a point that I made yesterday in a comment that I made. The recent renewal in the urban history of the conflict stems in part, I think, from the realization that rigid historiographical boundaries drawn between the local, the national, the imperial, and the global simply just do not do justice to the social history of the war. In towns and cities across the belligerent world, soldiers and civilians responded to the conflict in a multiplicity of ways that belies, for instance, the myth of war enthusiasm or the existence of a unique or unified war culture, a concept that's been central to reflections in France in particular. Patriotism did nonetheless matter, and wartime loyalty was not the exclusive reserve, as you know, of Western nation states. A multinational polity like the Habsburg Empire could tap into much greater and deeper reserves of loyalty than traditional nationalist historiographies would have us believe. In other contexts, the war experience also contributed to the process of nationalization, including in Italy and Russia, at times of political fundamental crisis. Now, the urban history of the war allows us to scrutinize the language and practices of patriotism. The defense of the nation, or the empire, was commonly articulated in communitarian terms and framed in the language of urban, class, religious, as well as imperial solidarities. Is infra, going back, you're welcome back. These infra and supra-national solidarities underpin the mobilization of urban civil societies in favor of combatants and war victims, something that some of you demonstrated better than I could yesterday. Although expressed in the most mundane words and habits, wartime patriotism should not be equated with the banal nationalism that Michael Billig deconstructed so effectively. For nationalism invokes an ideological coherence, as well as a systematic primacy of the nation, but I think it fails to render the characteristic of patriotism. And Billig's work also ignores the potential of patriotism to sustain social mobilization, sometimes against the state. Indeed, as the urban experience of the war attests, the mobilization of urban communities did not necessarily set them in a collision course with national mobilization, even when protesters took on the state authorities, as we see in many countries during the conflict. The relationship between the national center and the urban periphery was one of collaboration and integration, as well as one of resistance and open conflict. For patriotism was and should be understood in both an anthropological and legal political sense, as a performance of solidarity to kith and kin, as a performance of loyalty to an imagined community of fellow citizens. Nationalism, both as a political project and as a category of analysis, is intimately bound up with the demands that the state may place on the citizen. By contrast, patriotism underlined the capacity to mobilize nationhood, to assert distance towards the state, and even to resist its authority in some cases, and we can talk about this further if you wish. The success of wartime national mobilization did not rest on an improbable national consensus, I think that much is clear, at least to me, but on the capacity of patriots of all hues to reconcile their diverging understandings of the national project, to defend the existence of the nation-state. And in this context, social movements performed a critical role, allowing social groups to assert the conditions of their participation in the war effort. I think the urban history of the war demonstrates the need to pay particular attention to the geography of belligerence, to go not only beyond but also below the nation, to think through the nation as post-colonial scholars have encouraged us to do, and indeed global historians have encouraged us to do. The good example, of course, of those social movements that I'm talking about are social movements of early allocation of resource, coal, food, and so on. I mean, the history of Central Eastern Europe is a perfect example of this. But what is interesting in the case of France and Britain is that even in cases where access to these resources was not really a critical issue, even in towns, and these are the cases that I looked at, that directly benefited, whose prosperity derived largely from the war, those contests, those social movements over the meaning of sacrifice, over the allocation of resources from manpower and soldiers to coal and food, also play a similar role. The other thing that and I'm trying to speed up a bit, the other thing that I looked at was the transformations of the state in wartime. I just tried to figure out what the state looked like, where the state operated during the war. And the history of the wartime state has largely and rightly focused on the national administrative structures and governmental agencies. But the comparative urban history of mobilization, I think, supplements this perspective with an investigation into the adaptation of public services to the exceptional circumstances of the conflict. And I think across the belligerent world, in most cases at least, what we see is that civil society, and often urban civil society, provided many of the material and human resources needed by the state. From strict control to flexible partnership, circumstances dictated the attitude of the state towards civil society organizations. Circumstances, if not universal goodwill, of course, imposed cooperation. And I think it's definitely very clear in the case of France and Britain, where the respective political system harnessed the resources of pluralist societies to preserve the delivery of key public services and to maintain, by and large, social cohesion. Now, let me now move on to reconstructions and replacement. Because I think here again, geography, this new geography of warfare and belligerence may help us. So I'm not working on the comparative history of urban reconstruction that was largely designed as a social history of the devastated regions of France and Belgium. The idea is also to offer a transnational history of that process, to look at the circulation of representations, people, funds involved in this process, to also look at the mobilization of international networks of philanthropy and expertise that contributed to the stabilization of Western Europe after 1980. Those networks operated within and across national boundaries in Western Europe and North America in particular. So this project will depart from traditionally state-centered and technical accounts, often financial and economic accounts of reconstruction, to combine social, urban, environmental, and transnational perspectives on the reconstruction and demobilization of belligerent societies. Now, of course, reconstruction, remembrance, and renewal appear indissociable, as the experience of war, violence, and invasion, of exile and occupation determine visions of the post-war urban and national communities. And the challenges of material reconstruction, of urban reconstruction, were indeed construed within a broader political and cultural narrative, which lent its significance to the way in which Allied nations came to terms with the war experience and its legacy. In the context of post-war cultural demobilization, the reconstruction was indeed one of the ways in which nations and towns and cities ascribe meaning and validate their wartime sacrifices. Now, the post-war reconstruction was first and foremost experienced as a replacement. If mobility had defined the war experience as much as stalemate, as I said earlier, it equally defined the period of reconstruction. And in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, again, this is going to be familiar to all of you, the roads were filled with soldiers on their way home and by refugees in search of one. While the fraught process of veterans' demobilization has attracted the attention of scholars of fascism, historians have only recently begun to explore the problems created by unprecedented movements and transfer of populations to old and new states alike. And I think now we've got a pretty good historiography on refugees across Europe. As paramilitary violence maintained many regions in a state of belligerence, the plight of displaced populations questioned the legitimacy and the structure of new national and revolutionary policies in Eastern Europe. The social history of these populations and of their fellow returnees in France and Belgium remains largely to be written. A concomitant attempt to resettle and relocate, both materially and figuratively, calls for a comparative and transnational approach. The challenge of reconstruction and resettlement were, of course, material and economic, that's very clear, but they were also social and cultural, as they required those populations to rebuild a place and sense of place. Now, this process was both intensely local and transnational, It called for the mobilization of material, political, and cultural resources at the level of urban and indeed rural communities as well, of the nation-states of empires. And it also involved a range of humanitarian organizations which often originated in the civil societies of formerly belligerent nations and in the wartime mobilization of transnational philanthropic networks. I mean, that much is clear in the Allied case, but I'd be interested to know what you think of this from the point of view of Eastern and Central Europe. Across the old empires brought down by war and revolution, it seems to me that the successor states also set out to reorient their transport infrastructures away from the old imperial metropolis and towards the new capital cities. But the war, of course, did not only brought new railway timetables. Along with the ensuing civil wars and revolutions, it redrew the political maps of Europe and of the world, again, something which is very well known. To the south of Europe, the experience of Fiume, Rijeka, further illuminates the transformation of post-imperial policies. Now, Fiume is, unfortunately, perhaps best known for the antics of Gabriele D'Annunzio than for its fascinating post-war experiment in reshaping sovereignty. And I am building on the work of a friend and colleague, Dominic Riel at the University of Miami, who's looking right now on this very process, on the ways in which the citizens of this city, Fiume, attempted to define sovereignty outside the framework of the nation-state and international law. The transition from war to peace in this very particular context is also a transition, or rather a very pragmatic attempt, to carve out a particular political and legal niche between the Habsburg imperial polity and the nationalizing project of the Italian state. It was effectively an attempt to manufacture sovereignty at the urban level. And I think Fiume illustrates the multifaceted impact of the war on imperial political geographies. So to conclude, this is the best part, conclusion, because it ends, not so much for what I say. What I would like to suggest is perhaps a typology of urban experiences of the war. Now, the urban history of the war has followed conventional lines of inquiry and explored the social history of urban communities and the history of municipal government. It also considered towns and cities as both symbols and victims of modernity. Alan Kramer has used the experience of cities and of Louvain in particular to investigate what he calls the dynamic of destruction. Roxanne Vincenzi looked at the post-war modern and rather fanciful imaginings of a reconstructed Paris in the minds of urban planners and architects. Paris, of course, had not suffered significant damages, but still. So there's no reason why we should not continue along these lines. I mean, there's clearly still a lot of work to be done in this way. But I would nonetheless suggest breaking with tradition a little bit to map the urban experience of the war in a different way. Conventionally, we use the size and function of towns and cities to distinguish different types of urban settlements, from large capital cities to small market towns, for instance. So I propose we map the urban experience of the war according to experience of violence, forms of victimization and mobilization. And I think that would obviously first locate urban battlefields, defined by the direct experience of combat. I think I've got a slide for you there. There you go. Second would come occupied towns and cities, which would illustrate that World War I was a war of siege, underpinned by colonial ambitions, including in Europe, of course. But our occupation was also a tool of peacemaking. Think of the occupation of Constantinople by British, French, and Italian armies between 1918 and 1923, for instance. Third would come the urban home fronts, where towns and cities are primarily sites of local, national, and imperial mobilization. Fourth, the reconstruction process, which stressed the specificities, in particular, I think, the specific temporalities of devastated urban communities, whose experience of mobilization and demobilization was out of sync with that of the national community as a whole. And last and perhaps not lists, I would encourage you to reflect on what I would call wartime urban catastrophes, like the Halifax explosion or the Salonika fire that happened in 1917. I was tempted to add this devastating earthquake in Italy and run about this at the same time. I don't know if you're familiar with these cases, but very briefly in Halifax, in Nova Scotia, Canada, a collision between a French cargo ship carrying high explosive and a Norwegian boat killed about 2,000 people in just one go and flattened a large part of the city, as you can see here, and even brought about a small tsunami. I mean, these are pictures reminiscent of the Western Front, right? You know what it is about. In Salonika, a domestic accident turned into a massive conflagration that engulfed and destroyed a third of the city, displaced tens of thousands of people and a large part of the Jewish community. And it's partly the reason why a large Sephardic community relocated to Paris, among other places. Efforts to deal with the fire were certainly hampered by the Allied commanders there, and by the French in particular. And I mentioned these wartime disasters to stress the need to place the urban experience of the war in the broader history of urban catastrophes. I leave it to you to decide whether these are truly war experiences. I think it might be interesting to think about this. But I think it's important to place the experience of war in the broader history of urban catastrophes. From San Francisco in 1900s to Beirut in the late 20th century, the capacity of urban settlements to recover from environmental catastrophes, industrial accidents, economic decline, and from the ravages of war revealed the strengths and the weaknesses of their social fabric. In dramatic circumstances, urban reconstruction also brings to light many issues of great importance to modern historians. The link between the built environment and local identity, the nature of social cohesion, what makes a city, in other words, the relationship between state and civil society, the emergence of transnational solidarity, etc. These are just some of the issues I think of primary importance to us all urban historians of the First World War. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Professor Purseigle. And you told that conclusion is the end, but it also is the beginning of our discussion. So let us make the space of this place full of questions and comments. Who is going to begin to start things up as well?
Thanks, Pierre. That was, as ever, interesting and original and fascinating. I haven't had very long to formulate this question, so I don't know how it'll come out, but I've got, as you know, a huge amount of sympathy with European histories of the war, less for global histories of the war, as you also know, for reasons that we've both gone into. But I just wondered, especially given today, where it's clear that nation-states are still pretty influential actors, and given that 1914 to 18 moves Europe from a continent of empires to a continent of states which at least claim to be nation-states, how one integrates the national history with the European, because it seems to me that European history in and of itself might be a bit misleading. Maybe it seems to be a combination of combining. And one last point, tying into urban history, of course, the subject of this conference, you talked about Fiume. You could have equally talked about Danzig, which is made a city-state under the League of Nations, but which is desperate to join a nation-state through much of the interwar period. So how do we combine that? I mean, is it necessary, in your view, to combine national and European histories?
Thanks very much, Alex. I mean, this is one of those paragraphs that I skipped over to make sure that I keep the time. But one of the points that I wanted to make, and then we made very, I think, strongly in the article we wrote for this analysis, is that trying to write a European or global history of the war should definitely not do away with the nation state, because the nation state is very clearly, well, the nation state of the nation is very clearly the sort of central category through which many, if not all, Belgian populations experienced the war. So the idea is to find ways to integrate these different spaces and these different categories. So I entirely agree on the need to think differently about the state, and in particular about how different identities contributed, underpinned the mobilization of the state, be it a nation state or an imperial state. So that's very clearly, I think, the case. I think that would be idiotic to write the nation state out of this story, in particular out of the story of the interwar period. I think you're absolutely right. I take the example of dancing. I'll definitely look into this. I think that's a very good point. Am I missing another question? I think I am.
No, I think it was a bit vaguely formulated. I just kind of wanted to push back a little bit about.
Okay.
I mean, the national narratives are massively problematic, and you know, I agree with everything you're saying, but I just wanted to kind of push back a little bit.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that's definitely not our intention to underestimate the place of the nation. What I've definitely been trying to do in my book, but in particular in the French case, because there's a great deal of discussion about the meaning of national war cultures and patriotism in France. And I don't think we've taken the notion of patriotism seriously enough in the French historiography. Is to take this seriously, but to look at not only the differences between nationalism and patriotism, but also at how patriotism is reconfigured along specific geographies. Thus the need to think about the urban aspects of the war experience. But equally, I think, and this is what we still miss, and it sounds perhaps paradoxical for an urban historian addressing a conference of urban historians to say this, but we're in desperate need of more work on the experience of the countrysides. I mean, you know, France, for instance, okay? You know, everybody will tell you that France is a rural society, that most French soldiers are farmers, rural people, and this is true, right? Well, we still haven't got a history of the French countryside in the First World War. We have a book on the history of French agriculture that was part of the Carnegie Foundation series of economic and social history, published in 1923, I think. Not much since. I mean, so how can we seriously talk about the French experience until we have that kind of social history? So, in other words, what I'm saying about the urban experience, about the need to think more seriously about patriotism, I think should also include the experience of rural population. I think German historians have done more work on this, and Benjamin Siemens is an example that comes to mind, and others, but I think, yeah.
Who's next? Who would like to comment? Give a question. Hey, wake up, please. Okay, so thank you. And I think that we can start our coffee break.